And what I want to talk with you about this morning is how dramatically these disruptive technologies are changing fundamentally the way we behave as individuals, but also as organizations and as a society. It's not a question of will the technology be there, because I can spell out for you, and you could as well, many of the disruptive technologies over the next 10 to 20 years. The question is, what will it do to the way we behave as individuals, as organizations, and as a society? And that's where I want to blow your mind wide open today. A lot of numbers. I'm big on numbers. I want to see the damn data. Without the data, it's nonsense, it's dogma. So I'll show you the data. It might be a bit numbing at times, but take it in. Because this is data that has been painstakingly put together to help illustrate the trajectory of the future, at least as far as the technology goes. What we still have to figure out is what does the behavior look like. By the year 2100, how many user community devices will we have? 100 times as many user community devices as there are grains of sand on all the world's beaches. Does this sound absurd? Do you want to recoil in disbelief? Do you want to grab me and throw me off the stage right now? You know what? I've got so much more credibility saying that today in 2020 about 2100 than I ever would have in 1960 saying that about 2020. I have more standing today to make that prediction than I would have in 1960 to say we'd be at 10 billion today. The reality is that we always underestimate the value that we can create through not just new technology, but through new behaviors. So that to understand truly how far we have to go means stretching your mind in a way that we're only accustomed to doing in science fiction. So we are future blind. Let's accept it. Let's accept it, and let's take a journey that helps us to better understand how we can break out of that current context to see, at least with a glimmer of hope, what that future might look like. This phenomenon of future blind, of incumbency, you see it over and over again. The greatest risk to any evolved, mature organization is its own incumbency. You saw it with Kodak. How can you build digital technology in your own laboratory, invent it in your own lab, and yet be put out of business by it? So we laugh at AT&T, but we see this over and over and over again. With Borders, Blockbuster is one of my favorites, because Blockbuster actually had streaming video before Netflix did. At one point, Blockbuster had talked to Netflix about buying them. But I figured, why the hell should we? We can build it ourselves. We already have it. We know what the technology is all about. So in an earnings call, after Netflix had gone public, Reed Hastings, their CEO, was conducting an earnings call with analysts and some of his key staff. And a few folks from Blockbuster, including John Antonocchio, their CEO at the time, were listening in on the call to see what Netflix had to say. And an analyst said to Netflix during the call, hey, what's going on with Blockbuster? How are you guys going to deal with that threat? And Hastings said, to be, cute about it, he said, you know what? Blockbuster's throwing everything at us but the kitchen sink. They can't do us in. John and his team heard this somewhere in Texas. Next day, a box arrives at Netflix addressed to Reed Hastings. You want to guess what was in the box? Damn right, stainless steel kitchen sink. This is the arrogance of incumbency, believing that you own the marketplace, that you have some God-given right to innovation. You don't. And the reality is that assetless businesses are devastating businesses that are asset heavy. Because that's the industrial ethos, be asset heavy, right? What Uber did to the cab industry was about disruption, not just because of a technology, but an assetless technology. So we're moving into an era where this industrial, this ethos of industrialism no longer works. I'm not going to throw it all out, by the way. I mean, there's precepts here that will continue to work. But fundamentally, we're making a shift from this scarcity model, which is the industrial era ethos, to an abundance model, which is the ethos of data. What do you do with that data? How do you maintain the privacy and the appropriateness of that data, and yet create insights and leverage the disruptive capability of what that data has to tell you? So we are entering, from a technological standpoint, an age of not AI is part of it, but an age of autonomy. Autonomous devices that can think and act and make decisions in concert with us, and sometimes in our absence. And we need that, because we desperately need the bandwidth with which to manage this very complex, sophisticated, and uncertain future. this plethora of disruption coming at us from every direction, so radically changing the way we behave as individuals, as organizations, as societies, is creating what I call these digital ecosystems that remove friction from experience, from process, and from industry. Friction is the nemesis. That is, if you were to draw a bullseye today and at the center of it put that one thing that we can eliminate that would most create value, efficiency, productivity, prosperity, health, and well-being, it would be the elimination of friction. We're doing a lot of work right now in the insurance industry with both payers and providers. The friction in that industry is killing us literally. Eliminating friction is the ultimate objective, I think, of every technology as we look over the next few decades or so, and certainly the next 100 years or so. Uber did it. We saw this. Uber did it by what? They didn't recreate the cab industry. They datafied it. They removed all the friction from the experience. And to me, whether you're a patient in healthcare or whether you're a rider in an Uber, it's the same principle. To me, I actually look forward to my Uber. Did anyone ever in the history of the world look forward to a cab ride? Never. Right? I look forward to my Uber. Experientially, there's no friction there. It's so damn easy. They get me. They know where I'm going to be. They understand me. Behaviorally, it fits my mode of living. That is what technology should do. Right? Get me, understand me, and adapt to me. This notion of frictionless applies to every industry, because every industry is laden with friction. It's a whole new way of thinking and visualizing and understanding organizations. Friction goes away, efficiency goes up. It is that simple. And I can't, we talked about the lens that you have. I can't walk into any organization, do anything as even a consumer, and not look at that experience and say, where's the friction, and why does that friction exist, and how could they eliminate it? And what would it be like if they did eliminate it? And what's the opportunity? And most assetless businesses, whether it be Uber or Airbnb or what have you, will be businesses that answer that question. How do we create a digital representation of the process, the person, the thing, the entity, whatever it is. And in that creation of the digital twin, what I'm going to call a digital self, how do we extract value then from the data that defines that digital self? Behavioral value, environmental value, contextual value, all related to the behavior of that digitized entity. Right? That notion of the digital self, I think, is one of the most central frameworks that we will use to better understand how we leverage this enormity of data that we're creating for ourselves. And I can give you a wonderful example of how this digital self is being used in practice today. And it's one of the coolest examples that I've come across, and use it as metaphor or as an analogy, if you will. But it's one, once you heard about it, you kind of can't unthink it when you look at different situations where a digital self might exist. So a few years back, Hurricane Irma blew through Florida. Created a lot of devastation, but had a fairly narrow footprint. It was an interesting hurricane because its path of devastation was pretty clear and predictable and ultimately relatively narrow. So there were a bunch of Tesla owners at the time, Tesla owners in Florida. At the time, Tesla was selling cars with 75 kilowatt batteries that could be throttled back to 60 kilowatts through software. And one of the drivers who was in the path of Irma said, hey, you know what, I'm in the dead zone here. Could you please, speaking of Tesla, could you please unthrottle me? With that extra 15 kilowatts, I can get out of the path of devastation. It gives me another 20 or 30 minutes of drive time, and I can get out of the path. I can't with 60 kilowatts. Tesla said, sure, absolutely. We'll do that. But what else did they do? They modified that one individual's experience, but they used that digital self because they had the data, right? Tesla is a data company. It's not a manufacturing company today. It's a data company. They took that data and said, you know what, let's find every Tesla that's throttled back, and let's unthrottle all of them for several days. Give them all that new range. What did they do? They changed the product in the moment. Real-time innovation, real-time manufacturing, assetless. Right? Because the assets are already in place, they're already deployed. Assetless does not mean the assets aren't there. It means that you have the ability through data to manipulate and manage them in a way that conforms to the environment or the individual or the behavior that needs to be addressed at that point in time. That's innovation. It's only innovative if it adapts to me with that sort of agility. Right? That's the power of having a digital self. The product, the experience, the service all combined and can be redeployed instantaneously based on behavior. Such a cool way to think about the way we'll innovate going forward. It's almost like an autonomic means of innovation, right? Where the human being doesn't even have to think about it. The system kind of does it on its own. So, anyone know the story of Air France 447? I think it was June 1, 2009. A few of you do. Very controversial, by the way. I will tell you that in researching this for the book, we pulled every report that's been written, every analysis of this. There's still a lot of ambiguity in what happened, but as best I can tell, this is what happened on 447. Airbus 330, incredibly powerful machine, flying from an intelligent machine, flying from Rio to Paris, June 1, 2009. 2 hours out of Paris had some problems. You want to guess, how many hours do you think a pilot hand flies from Rio to Paris of 330? How many hours? Yeah, 7 minutes. 7 minutes, right? This machine can fly itself. The pilots are there kind of to make you feel better about the experience, but this machine could literally fly itself. However, there are certain cases where the machine cannot fly and will hand off to the human. One of those is if it doesn't know what its airspeed is. So how could it not know what its airspeed is? They hit a thunderstorm. Ice formed around what's called the pitot tube. The pitot tube is a little pencil-like device in the fuselage of the plane. You'll see this. Look at the plane next time. On the belly of the plane, you see this little pencil-like device that sticks out. That is the pitot tube. And the pitot tube tells you what your airspeed is by using air pressure that's coming in through this little tiny hole on the pitot tube. If it ices up, it usually melts because there's heating elements on the pitot tube. In this one case, it iced up so badly that airspeed indications were gone. Computer can't fly without airspeed indications, so what does it do? Hands it back to the pilot. Says, hey, I can't do this anymore. Pilots take control. 2 pilots at that point on the flight deck. The pilot in command, the captain, was taking a nap in one of the back berths, which they do that. It's a long flight. And the pilot in command at that point on the flight deck, Pierre Cedric, did the last thing you should do, pull the yoke back. Now, I could get into so many reasons why that was a bad idea and why they weren't able to recover from that, but here's what happened empirically. He pulled back on that yoke and never once let go of it. When you pull back after the computer disengages the autopilot, you are put into what's called alternate law. Alternate law is when the pilot can do anything he or she wants with the plane. When you're in normal law and the computer has control, you cannot stall this plane. A stall is when you lose lift. Remember the Bruni principle? You lose lift and you fall out of the sky like a brick. You don't glide, you fall. For about 7 minutes, they fell until they finally entered the icy waters of the Atlantic, killing 228 people. Why did Pierre Cedric pull back on the yoke? No one really knows. Best we can figure is that he was disoriented. He felt the plane was in a dive. Some of his instruments were actually telling him the plane was in a dive. It wasn't. And when he pulled back, he tried to gain altitude, which you don't do because that's how you stall a plane. You can't tell you're stalling. You don't have that sensibility when you're in clouds and you don't have visual references. Here's where it gets absolutely horrifying, though. 2 minutes after the computer handed off, it was ready to take control again. It could have flown the plane at that point because the pitot tube had cleared. Worse yet, in that 7-minute period, the stall warning, which is impossible to ignore, sounds something like this: stall, 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 3 times, quite loud, fills the flight deck. You can't ignore it. And then a high-pitched, like a fire alarm going off or a CO2 detector going off, also sounds to tell you you're in a stall. That's a pretty serious thing, right? You're falling out of the sky. 70 times in 7 minutes, this stall warning announced. Not once, according to the black box, did either of the 2 pilots at that point acknowledge that the plane was in a stall. The plane could have flown itself. It was screaming bloody murder that something wrong was happening, and yet they still ended up plunging into the Atlantic. And there's one word for it: arrogance. The arrogance of the human being, right? I have control. I make the decisions. When in fact what we should be doing is accepting and acknowledging that we are collaborators. We are collaborators with an entirely new species with which we are going to better survive and navigate the future. I mean, it is that simple. It is that simple at the end of the day. But we don't want to accept it. So when you look forward, right, over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, pick your time frame, what are those things that are most going to change from a technology standpoint to alter our behaviors? And they are this notion of collaborating with autonomous devices, the importance of eliminating friction from our businesses, the degree to which we create ecosystems that can seamlessly work together, bound together by the superglue of the future, which is what? Data. Data is the superglue of the future. That's what's going to create and inform every innovation over the next 100 years. And ultimately, how do we do that with devices, with data, and with an entirely new set of demographics that we're not accustomed to?